All right, folks, we're actually live at this point.
Hello, folks. This is Roger Ball. I'm on.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. Good evening.
And we are done. So it should be appearing on my Facebook page at this point. So, and everyone else in the world can now hear us. So good evening to everyone. Welcome. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to please like and share at this point. The conversation continues. We're going to be talking about what the Black agenda should be in the times that we are living in the context of mental health and wellness. And this is part 2 of this particular series, but this is like the 10th in the entire series of what the Black agenda is and what that will look like. This was such an expansive conversation the last time that we definitely needed it to continue on today. So thank you for taking time out on Father's Day weekend to join us on this evening. Please like and share at this time. And actually, I'm going to attempt to show the video that I wanted to show in the last live Zoom concerning systematic racism. And there it is.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Okay. And that was to try to give us some grounding and where we're going with today's conversation. If you are joining us on Facebook, please like and share and prepare to ask any questions that you might have concerning the conversation. So, like I said, the last time that we were here, this idea and concept of the Black agenda is certainly not a new one. As a matter of fact, it's just kind of coming back around, as history tends to repeat itself quite often. And for me, as a local elected official located in Connecticut, who also manages multiple YMCAs that are mostly in urban communities, I found myself wondering what the impact of what has been happening nationwide would have on all of the communities that we serve, from my pre-K kids all the way up to seniors up to almost 98 years old. And the impact of mental health and wellness and the stigmatization that's around it, and what barriers we kind of have to go over in order to break down those barriers from folks to really engage and to connect the dots, in particular surrounding spiritual wellness and whatever that means for you. I believe, in my personal context, it is based and founded in a Christian perspective, but I'm sure others may have varying opinions. But I believe it is almost a similar approach that many in the Black community may take in terms of wellness and grounding yourself in these types of conversations. Now, I'm going to say that I am nowhere near an expert compared to any of these individuals. I probably will likely be asking the silly questions as we are trying to explore and learn, and also provide the community that we are actually broadcasting live to are of many different races and creeds, and really are trying to learn as well. So there may be some basic questions that come across, and I don't want anyone out in Facebook land or Zoom to feel shy about that and asking those questions. We're going to do all of this in love. So I'm going to have my wonderful panel of experts introduce themselves in the number order that we all arrived. So let's get going, and you can unmute yourself as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation for part 2. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of saying hi to before, my name is Tiara Anderson. I am a licensed master's social worker. I got my master's degree from the University of Maryland. I graduated back in 2016. And from my matriculation at University of Maryland, I went on to work at a mental health clinic. I also worked on a couple of federal research projects along with Virginia Tech and College Park, University of Maryland College Park. And now I currently serve as an employee assistance counselor on Capitol Hill, where I serve Congress, Congressional Budget Office, and Capitol Police. We, in employee assistance capacity, is basically just like workplace counseling. I'm not sure if people either on the call or who's listening, tuning in to us are familiar with EAPs, but that's essentially what I do. So workplace counseling along with different trainings, retreat facilitations, and so forth. So that's me. Thank you again for having me be a part of the conversation.
Well, hi everyone. I am Sheena Hutchinson, and a little bit about me. I first will say that I am bivocational, and so what that means is that I'm an ordained minister, but also I am an educator, an accountant by trade. And so when I say educator, I also teach business education in a urban public school system. About my education, I attended Southern Connecticut State University, where I graduated with a finance degree. And then I also attended Howard University School of Divinity. And so I have a vast knowledge of like just different areas, but my main focus is really mental health, emotional health, and then money. I call it the me factor, like money and emotions. And so that's kind of where I draw a lot of my expertise from.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chaz Brackeen. I am currently a social worker. I've been in the social work field for about 10 years. I am also a proud graduate of Fordham University, Westchester campus. And tonight, I'm glad to be on this panel again tonight for part 2. And on tonight, I would like to really just kind of like hone in and just discuss where do we go from here based off everything that's been going on these past couple of months. I want to really focus on tonight. Where do we go from here? And then also self-care. How do we as professionals in the mental health field, how do we take care of ourselves? And then how do we also take care of others that we're in contact with?
Greetings, everyone. My name is Malikka Miller, and I am an alumni of the Fordham University School of Social Service program. It is an honor to be here on today. I have an extensive background in providing therapeutic services to children, youth, and families that have experienced various traumas of all backgrounds. I've also served as a liaison between youth in foster care and assisting them in being able to attain access to higher educational programs. I am also working currently as an early intervention applied behavioral analysis therapist for youth, for children that are on the autism spectrum. It is an honor to be here on today, and it is a pleasure to sit on a panel of none other than one of the most influential professors from Fordham University that has had I've had the pleasure of helping. He has helped to rear me in my professional, in academia, and in terms of my growth and professional development. And that is none other than Dr. Roger Ball, and pastor. So it is a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I look forward to round 2, and let's get it going.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shenira Billups. I am a national certified counselor and licensed professional counselor. I've over a decade of experience in the field. Just to cut to the chase, I've done inpatient, outpatient, respite homes, doing hospitalizations, everything. Currently, though, I am fully in private practice work. I do have my business, Mental Growth and Internal Healing LLC. just really focus on a lot of community work. This field is both personal and professional for me. I have a 6-year-old son who is on the spectrum, but he is the joy of my life. And being a single mom, that he's definitely my world. As far as tonight, what I hope to look into is, as Chaz had mentioned earlier, a lot of self-care. I find that to be the center of what many of my clients deal with and struggle with daily, but also many professionals, many of my colleagues. Sometimes during peer talks, but we're able to discuss and dig deeper into and what that means for us, especially during the era like now where so many of our Black and Brown brothers and sisters are struggling because of current events and how it impacts us as a community, and what we can do to educate ourselves to really bring unity amongst not only ourselves, but just anyone of any creed, color, race, whatever you want to call it. So, and also just definitely talk about the children if we can tonight. Love children, love the kitties. So yeah, I'm looking forward to everything tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jermaine Thomas. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. As far as my education, I attended Georgetown University in undergrad, and I obtained my doctorate from Alder University. I am a New Haven native, and I actually attended high school with Darryl Brackeen, so it's nice to be amongst a former Hill House alum, or a current Hill House alum, rather. I currently practice at a non-for-profit faith-based group practice named Cornerstone Counseling Center of Chicago, and there I deliver therapy services to adults and couples, and the clinical presentations that I mainly work with are depression, anxiety, trauma-related disorders, and marital discord. So that's my background, and it's a pleasure to be a part of such an esteemed panel. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Pleasant good afternoon, everyone. I'm humbled and honored to have been asked to be a part of this panel. My name is Roger Ball. I am extraordinarily grateful and proud to be sharing the stage and the panel with two of my former students, Chaz and Malikka, who were just, extraordinarily amazing scholars at Fordham University, where I've been teaching for the last decade. I was probably in my very early 30s when I started there. I also serve as a pastor in the Bronx. I am an assistant principal in New York City public education system, and I consider myself to be a relentless advocate for the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and those who are ignored and forgotten by society. And I'm humbled and honored to be a part of this. I could go on and on and on, but I am extraordinarily excited to see my former students in some ways do their presentations here. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm grateful.
Thank you all so very much. Like I said, I pale in comparison to the knowledge that is here on tonight, which means that we're going to really have a great dialogue. Actually, I just want to kind of land, and again, this is part 2, so we did cover a lot last time, and I'm going to try not to backtrack. We're just going to kind of jump in on the deep end here. So I'm just going to read a few factoids. So tonight I'm going to read the quotes. I'm going to read some facts, not necessarily ask questions. And then I want people to kind of react based on your professional experience and what this means to each and every one of you. So I'm reading actually an article from the African American Health Association. African Americans are at risk for mental and behavioral health problems. 40% of youth in the criminal justice system and 45% of children in foster care are African American, according to the U.S. Surgeon General's report. Psychologists can work to eliminate or reduce behaviors prevalent in foster care children, such as aggression, fighting, negativism, and isolation. Next, 25% of African American youth who have been exposed to violence have proven to be at high risk for post-traumatic stress disorder according to the U.S. Surgeon General. Psychologists can teach community intervention methods such as a dialogue and coalition building, as well as interpersonal communication, negotiation, mediation, and community organizing. For traumatic stress, practitioners can encourage youth to contemplate the psychosocial impact of violence, loss, and suffering, as well as crisis response skills. Next, African Americans are nearly twice as likely as non-Hispanic whites to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, and practitioners have become an integral part in programs that help to treat schizophrenic patients, allowing them to live normal, independent lives by teaching them to handle the symptoms, effects of schizophrenia. Lastly, African Americans are twice as likely to have diabetes as whites, substantially more likely to die of stroke, and around 10% more likely to have some form of heart disease. Practitioners play an essential role in helping people modify their behavior to prevent and recover from chronic illnesses like this. They have developed treatment and prevention programs for some of America's most seriously behaviorally based health problems. Poverty and social structures are barriers to psychological services. There are many studies that show African Americans are just as much at risk for mental health illness as their white counterparts, yet receive substantially less treatment. According to the Census Bureau data, African Americans were 7.3 times likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods with limited to no access to mental health services. Go.
I would start by saying that while we could focus on the social issues, we could focus on the mental health issues, we could focus especially for African American males who are more, at an increased risk for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and complete suicidal attempt. I think we could look at all of those things. But the root cause, I think in part, is what this conversation is very much about. The root cause is a historic racism and oppression of a particular group of people that has given rise to things like stigmas and lack of healthcare access to this particular subgroup. So in my mind, the conversation is not just about how to treat, but how to stem and disrupt and subvert a historical approach to subjugating a particular group of people.
And just to kind of piggyback off of what Dr. Roger Ball has previously mentioned, I think the very key significant difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and racial trauma and being exposed to race-based stress is that with PTSD, usually the trauma is something that we have then moved forward from, and the individual is no longer exposed to that particular trauma. But with race-based stress, it is a re-exposure to trauma, right? So we're not even giving the opportunity to be able to heal because it is a constant exposure and re-exposure to the trauma. So, and kind of honing in on what it is that we are to do in terms of being able to move forward, we do have to get to the root cause, which I believe is not only a policy issue, but it's also a matter of the heart and the mind, because we can change policy, we can change the way in which, laws and legislation are amended. However, the way in which they are interpreted and the fight that it would take to be able to honor that which is legislated will be a continuous fight. So it is a heart and a matter of the mind change. Systematic racism has been embedded in the soul and the soil of that which is constructed in the land in which we live, which is supposed to be the land of the free, but it has been proven that that is not the case. So we do have to figure out a way in which that we can really get to the root cause of the matter, which is a matter of the mind and the heart.
I want to echo and expand upon some of the things that have already been said. The term trauma has really entered into common parlance lately, and it's really pervaded the dominant discourse lately. And I think that's a good thing, because sometimes when people see an issue and they sort of divorce it from, let's say the pernicious effect of, let's say, the past, people are looking at things too narrowly. So, the traumas that's already been mentioned are, well, slavery and the other vestiges of that system, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, et cetera. And those things still cast their shadow on our society today. And it informs the way in which African Americans operate in this world. And I think it also informs the way in which whites relate towards blacks. And we really have to reckon with that truth. And, the most terrible, I guess, trauma that most people have sort of observed recently is the heinous and sort of exhibitionistic killing of George Floyd. And I think that image has really seared the minds of so many Americans, but particularly African Americans, because I think a lot of us saw ourselves in George Floyd. And, I even think about myself and just sort of demographically, it's like, well, when I think about George Floyd or even Ahmaud Arbery, and I'm not negating the experience of Breonna Taylor, but just thinking about demographically, these are Black men, relatively tall, dark ebony skin with an athletic build, and I think, well, that could have been me, right? And I think a lot of African Americans are thinking about that. And given that we're talking about trauma today, I think it's probably helpful for our listeners to get a sense of how trauma works and how it operates in the brain. So we've all been endowed with this bifurcated brain. So we have these two hemispheres and our brains sort of split in that way. And our left hemisphere is responsible for the production and perception of language, and our right hemisphere is sort of responsible for sort of the projection and sort of conjuring of images. And a lot of times when we experience a trauma, it sort of presents itself in this sort of fractured imagistic way in our right hemisphere. And it just feels like chaos, right? And that's when people start saying they're having these sort of intrusive images in their mind and they don't really know what to do about it. And I would say, and most mental health professionals are aware of this, and I think it's really helpful for laypersons to know this, that the best way to really sort of process through trauma is to, well, sort of assign language to it. And that's where your left hemisphere comes in, where you can sort of transition those sort of fractured images into something that goes from something like chaos to order. And that's why it's so important to talk about these things, But I think, unfortunately, what's happened is African Americans in general, they're reluctant to pursue therapy services because I think what happens is there's sort of what presents in people's minds is sort of a therapist who doesn't look like them, who doesn't really understand or appreciate their experience. So they're worried that they won't be understood. So they keep all these things in, they don't talk to anybody about it. And it has this pernicious effect on their mood and their bodies, right? And it's a real dilemma, because even as an African-American psychologist, let's say I'm meeting with a couple and I want one of the parties of the couple to see an individual therapist. The greatest difficulty I run into is that the pool of African-American therapists, particularly male therapists, is so shallow that they often don't feel like there's many people to go to. So I'm really hoping that over the course of time, there are more African-Americans who are looking to go into the mental health field so that people who look like us feel like there's someone who they can actually talk to. So I'm sure, there's a lot more to discuss in terms of that, but those are some of the things that came to mind based on what people have said and based on that quote that you read, Darryl.
I definitely agree with Dr. Thomas as far as the stigma that's placed behind therapy in the Black and Brown community, even running into many I counsel as far as the male population. That's something that I often run into where the kind of reluctance to talk about issues or speak about problems. So I try the approach of basically talking about them meeting basic needs or challenges that they might come up against socially speaking. And as we dive more into that, I kind of gently prod for more emotional depth and also emphasize that this is a safe space for you to discuss these things. I find that a lot of my clients too feel much safer when they do see someone who can relate with them because they verbalize that to me and say, it's really good to have somebody here who can like have another sister here who understands where I'm coming from, and they may not use all the big clinical jargon. They keep it real. They go based upon whatever it is, wherever it is they come from, and just meeting them where they're at and being able to redirect conversation as needed, but understanding whatever the situation is, to just look at certain points, especially when it comes down to trauma, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, putting a name to it, putting words to it, because it does look very chaotic. They're coming in, they don't know what to do, they're already feeling flustered, flooding thoughts, can't sleep at night, extreme night sweats, family not understanding where they're coming from, freezing at certain points, not understanding the triggers that they have. When you are able to kind of zone in and really discuss with them their personal thoughts and emotions, kind of lining things up, for them it's like, okay, so it makes sense. I experienced this in my childhood, and this is why I'm so affected by this certain situation. They're able to put it together. But even coming from a professional point of view, sometimes it may take a little while to unearth all of those issues, but it's a matter of helping them to be able to process it, because at the end of the day, they have to go home to that same thing. So it's a matter of when they're ready to go ahead and take out and unleash, but also making sure that that time doesn't serve as a barrier, because sometimes they'll stall, sometimes they'll kick back because they feel as soon as more pressure is applied, you can tell when the clients may feel it. But taking that time to do that, educating ourselves about their backgrounds, and just seeing them where they are. And then with the children, that's huge. Children continue to fascinate me who have gone through trauma, because I get those who may be very shy and not very forthcoming, and then those who are extremely anxious. They tend to be so clear, direct, and just raw as far as what they've heard and what they've seen. But for them, it's of extreme importance. I dealt with another particular case where the children, their sisters, and they both experienced the same thing, but the sisters are totally opposite. But one of them, though, she heard something from her father about the father saying, "I just want the kids to forget about the mom." And the guardian was like, "What? I can't believe this." But I took time to help her process that. It's like, let's take the focus off of the fact that she heard something that was totally inappropriate for a child to be hearing, and let's talk about what she was feeling, what she was experiencing, and what she heard. And it was just amazing, the things that came out of her mouth based upon the direction we were going. But it's really important just to address those things, especially within our community.
So I want to bring up something called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is an extremely uncomfortable mental state. It's a word that we use in the mental health field. It's an extremely uncomfortable mental state, and it's a distance between what you believe on a gut level and also versus what you know to do is right. It's a discomfort that arises when choices or actions that are required that have been strongly pre-existing attitudes towards it. Now, when Dr. King was assassinated, he was the most hated man in America because his words evoked something which is called cognitive dissonance. A lot of times during the riots and the rallies that took place back in the 60s, it evoked something called cognitive dissonance. There's a book that came out like about 10 years ago. It's called Where Do We Go From Here? And it's a book that clearly Dr. King, obviously he was the author of that book, and it clearly articulated for us trauma and basically for just things for us to pay attention to. In that book, he also talked about trauma that is associated with being Black in America. And there's been so much triggers these past few months. However, thankfully, we are still standing as African Americans. And Dr. King, he recognized that cognitive dissonance is something that needed to be addressed. So anybody else want to touch on cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about, like, so everything that everyone said was really awesome. But I really want to talk about, so we talked about trauma, we talked about the different areas of trauma. What I want to pose to us is, like, how do we change the narrative, right, of combating trauma, right? And so we do know that trauma, sometimes people experience trauma based on different variations of things, right? So sometimes it can be environmental, or some things can be based on, you know, go to military. But I guess what I'm really trying to like understand or to bring up in this conversation is, how do we re-image the aspect of trauma? How do we heal? How do we bring healing to one? And so, or when I'm thinking about this whole idea of racism, and, you know, we talk about African Americans, I guess I just have a lot of thoughts, because I think that before we know where we're going, we have to know where we come from, right? And I think that's part of the re-imaging of who we are. And honestly, I went to Ghana last year, and that was a different experience for me that actually awakened me in such a way that if we understand where we came from, right, in terms of, like, I'm not just saying African Americans, but I'm also taking Caribbean Americans, right? Because I know for me, my parents are Caribbean. And so my grandparents and my parents did not experience the civil rights movement, right? They experienced a different type of oppression. And so, and I'm able to connect the dots and help them to understand the importance of what happened during the 60s and during the civil rights movement. It was because of the Immigration Act of 1965, I think it was around that time, that allowed, you know, people of African descent to actually come into our country, right? And so when I start thinking about how to reconcile and how do we re-image, right, race, or how do we like approach to, I guess, re-image how we think about racism and how we think about how to, you know, go forth. I guess my question is, like, how do we change the narrative? How are we going to move forward with, like, everything? I don't know if that makes sense with everyone, if I'm making sense. But I really want us to ask, like, how do we re-image what it is that we are trying to do? Because we want to talk about, so when we're not just talking about African American, but we should be saying, you know, Black, because I think that it's a wide range. I think that's affecting even everyone across the country, because even people that are in, people that I met in Ghana, it's almost affecting them. So I think what we're dealing with is a global thing now, even though, yes, we have to heal here, but I think it's much more deeper than we really think it is. So I know I'm like kind of all over, but I want to really ask us, how are we going to re-image our thought and our thinking process as we go forward?
So I'll answer that question first. So basically there's many ways that you can kind of heal from trauma. Actually, couple of weeks ago, I was reading a book. It's called Radical Healing from Trauma. And there's many ways that you can begin to heal from trauma. So I'll just start by saying the first one. So like the first one that you can do is develop a sense of pride. Be proud of who you are. Be proud of your heritage. And own it. Constantly check in with yourself, renew your mind, and dig into it deeper. So we're African Americans, so constantly check in with yourself. Be aware of who you are as an African American man, as an African American woman. Just constantly just walk around with that sense of pride. When was it? Yesterday was Juneteenth, and all over social media, I kept posting, happy Juneteenth, happy Juneteenth. So I was carrying that sense of pride. And I even told myself, you don't just carry that sense of pride of being Black on Juneteenth. You gotta be proud of being a Black woman every day. So that's, in my opinion, that's a start that you can do, is to just definitely be very aware, and then just be very, have pride. And then also, you can also share your story. That's another thing about African Americans. We are always, our culture digs deep into storytelling. And if we go back centuries, back into from our ancestors, we are big on telling storytelling, because it brings a sense of healing. It also just helps us to kind of vent. So I feel that that's another way to be able to heal from trauma, is just be able to pick up the phone, call a friend, go on Instagram or Facebook Live, and just share a story. And that will definitely help to cleanse you from just everything that you may be experiencing due to the trauma from just everything going on. And then lastly, practice self-care. That's a huge thing that we can do right now. You cannot help others if you don't help yourself. So just check in with yourself daily, throughout the day. Do things that bring you joy. And because you know why? Fighting is exhausting. So the protests that we're having right now, some are peaceful, some are not. So remember to take care of yourself, because the fighting, the riots is very, very, very exhausting. And you know what? We're going to be in this for the long haul. It's not going to, go away in one day. So remember to practice self-care.
So, and those are all great things that we can do, right? And I know all those things we do. I guess for me, I'm talking more on like a systematic level, right? So I'm saying more, so we as educators, we can do that, right? Mm-hmm. And so when I'm saying, how do we change that re-imaging? And I'm not just talking about me, I'm just talking about, right, we're thinking about systemic. I just think about the children that I teach, right? We can keep talking and talking to them, but they're not going to necessarily hear that per se. And so when I'm talking about, like, there are environments that causes even more trauma, right? So they're experiencing the trauma that they're seeing on TV, right? I've been out protesting, and yes, self-care is important. There's sometimes I am not on social media. Like yesterday morning, I did a prayer protest down at the White House, and I was off of social media all day. I didn't post Juneteenth stuff, right? Because I know that I have to process things, right? I can't just constantly be on social media. So but I know me, right? And I know I need to go sometimes in my cocoon so I can rebuild myself, and so that I can be effective, right? So I understand how to process and do things like that. I guess my thing is, how are we going to, right? This is the Black agenda. How are we going to do that for the majority? How are we going to do that for our children? How are we going to change the narrative for, a mother who, they don't even have food to eat. They don't want to hear, oh, just go breathe, breathe. So I'm just saying, how do we now change the narrative for, like, individuals who don't have that education? And so again, like, how do we, I guess my thing is, like, I want us to come up with a plan on how can we as, you know, as this group, how can we affect change? How can we retell the stories? And I mean, I know some things that we can do, but I really want us to really come up with solutions and problems. And sometimes theories are really good and great, but sometimes it's hard to put those theories into practice because of the different traumas that people have. Now, I can talk about spirituality and all those different things, but let's talk about some of the basic things that we can do to help re-image or, you know, retell the story of helping someone come out of the trauma, and helping them to even understand, like, you know, racism and how deep racism is.
If I may jump in.
Sorry. I think it was like 3 people at once. I'm sorry. I'll wait. Go ahead,
Okay. Okay, if I may jump in on that, I think, Sheena, the question that you are bringing up is one that students and colleagues and my colleagues oftentimes struggle with, right? And I think what I'm hearing you saying is around, where do we begin, right? Where do we focus? And I think it's not this or that, right? In some ways, I think it's all of us based on our strengths and our passions and where we are, that we choose where we want to leverage our energy and our time. So to go back to human behavior, to my two colleagues on the conference, the micro, the meso, and the macro, right? So the question I'm hearing you asking is around the macro. And so oftentimes we think in terms of the micro. Let us help this individual. Let us empower this person. Or the meso, let us support this small group or this family, or right? And so that's usually where much of the energy is placed or focused. But I think I'm hearing you saying, how do we, in one fell swoop or systematically, tackle the big issues, right? Because you can help an individual, you could help a family, but the truth of the matter is they will still have to contend with institutional and systemic racism. And this is where, this is a fascinating time in history where people are marching and you see police department, governors, mayors, local politicians, police chiefs are saying that we are either dismantling the police departments or we are reimagining what, we're banning chokeholds and we are, shining, I believe it's Leonard Cohen that says, ring the bell that still can ring. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in. That is saying that we want to shed some light into the way policing takes place in communities of colors. And so in some ways, the question that you're asking, in some ways is being answered today through the actions of marching and, and resisting and subverting and really shedding the light on. I know there's some lootings and things like that. That's frankly, it's a distraction to the existential needs of Black people in America. And so I think the question that you're raising around how do we not just deal with the individual struggle, but how do we deal with the existential struggles of Black and brown people in America? And I think we just need to look at the signs of the times, frankly, look across the continental United States and some of the actions that are being taken and how we can join in solidarity with some of those actions to really affect changes. I think sometimes as an individual, we struggle with how do we sign on? How do we join in solidarity with those who are in the fight? It may mean being arrested. It may mean not getting paid. It may mean driving across the country to march in peace and solidarity, but makes absolutely no mistake about it. The work and the resistance in French is vive la résistance. The resistance that is taking place across the country is exactly what is needed. And one by one, we see state after state, police departments, mayors, governors are really saying, Confederate monuments are being ripped down and policies are being changed. People are being arrested. In some ways, it's no different from what was taking place in the civil rights era of 1960, in the 1960s, that is taking place today. So my sister, what I would say to you is look to the signs, look to what is taking place across the country, from letter writing to calling our congresspersons and our senators, and see how ordinary Americans, Blacks and whites and Latinos and Asians and people whose brains and minds about race and racism are being transformed, and they're coming face to face, and couples who are white and Black who are posting pictures and videos to say that Black lives matter. So I think you are in the middle of a renaissance and in the middle of a revolution, and to see that and to embrace that, I think is critically important.
Yes, I agree. I really agree with everything everyone is saying. I think it's a great conversation to have, and it's really necessary. But one thing that I thought about as Sheena spoke, and also as Dr. Ball spoke, I think both of you, the exchange has been great. And I think one thing that really came to my mind when I heard both of you speaking, it really was about, and not that this is going to be the end all be all answer to your question, Sheena, but I think that one thing that we can do to help is what we're doing now, is raising awareness. I think that systematic racism and tackling that, while similar and it has correlation to trauma, I think that we have to look at trauma differently too. And I think for you, and I think earlier when you were speaking, you mentioned, like, as an educator, when you speak with your students, for example, how do you help them with the trauma that they've been experiencing? And I think for myself too, when I speak with my clients, and I have clients of all different colors, and people are being impacted in many different ways. Some people don't even mention it. But for the people who are really struggling with it, it's about, I think, them being able to acknowledge that this is a trauma, or I've been traumatized, or I'm experiencing trauma from this, because we can't go around and seeing our Black brothers and sisters, our brown brothers and sisters, and saying, you are traumatizing, let me help you with your trauma. People have to come to a realization for themselves. And so I think raising awareness is very helpful. Having conversations like this, seeing what's happening around the world, how we're all joining in together, we're all also able to say some of what we've been seeing in the news has been really traumatizing for us. And so we're able to connect and to glean off of one another because of our shared experiences. And I think when it comes to helping people on an individual level, we have to have conversations with them that ignite self-determination in them, so that they can say, I feel like I have been either experiencing some secondary trauma, or I've been traumatized by what I've seen in the news or my own experiences in my community. We have to give them space to say that. And then we can say, well, as a clinician, I can say, I have tools that I can do to help them with that. But for people who are on the call or who are listening, who may not be clinicians, but who do work in the community in some way, you can develop some resources that you can share, whether it be with parents or whether it be with your school principal, trying to plan, how do we have conversations when we do get back into the school together? How do we have conversations, and how do we bring in maybe panels like this so that kids and students and adolescents, they have the opportunity to ask questions and start thinking about it? Because one thing that helps in healing, and I wanted to throw this in addition to what you said, Chaz, when we're trying to heal from trauma, one thing that helps us is the ability to be able to acknowledge, to be able to put words to the trauma. A lot of times people aren't walking around saying, I've been traumatized, let me go find help for my trauma. People don't know why they're angry. People don't know why they feel really sad or why they feel really depressed. Sometimes people don't even know to use the words depression to define how they're feeling. So I think one of the things that we want to help people do and assist people in doing is putting words to the issues. One of the things that I use when I'm doing CBT work with my clients, it's really corny, but I always say you have to name it to tame it. So you have to name what you're dealing with in order to tame it. And once you do that kind of gives you a kind of freeing experience, because you no longer have to feel like something weird's happening. I'm confused by what's going on in my life or what's happening in my head. Now I can say, oh, that's what that is. So let me go figure out what I do about that. And so I think raising awareness, holding safe space for people, and allowing people to kind of tap into their own self-determination around the experiences that may have been traumatizing for them can be really helpful too.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much meat that we're discussing, and I'm actually digesting and processing all that has been said that is so relative to what it is that we are discussing here today. But I think in terms of being able to change the narrative, I think one of the very most important things that we need to do within the Black community is also being able to look at the way in which we have perceived therapeutic services, counseling, therapy, because it oftentimes has a very negative connotation with how men, especially men of color, have been emasculated for seeking therapeutic services. At more of a micro level, I think that it's important, and even a meso, to look at the way in which family dynamic plays a role in how we perceive the services that are available to us. I think you mentioned earlier on that the CDC has indicated that due to a lot of the stress, race-based traumas that we face, there are physiological responses, psychological responses that play a huge role in the way in which we respond, right? And we have not yet had the ability to recover from a lot of the traumas. But I think one of the most basic things that one of my colleagues has mentioned, who is also a psychologist, she mentioned that one of the basic things that we can do at the micro level is to, in the moments where we are experienced hypervigilance or uncomfortable situations, the most basic thing that we can actually do is to breathe. Breathing helps us to be able to release oxygen into our bodies, our muscles, we become tense, and just being aware of the emotions in which we feel and not suppressing them. I think people of color, I think that we have become masters at being able to code switch and being able to suppress our emotions when given and having to be present in professional settings. And we have gone a number of different environments where, we have to maintain a certain level of professionalism, and we have to play face, right? So I think that in terms of looking at how we perceive supportive services, looking at the ways in which healthcare disparities can no longer exist within our community, so that those that are in need would then not have to pay out of pocket, but then would be ensured to be able to have access to these resources. And then also looking at the ways in which we heal, right? Healing is an intentional process. We have to be intentional about starting the process of healing and really being transparent about that which we face on a consistent basis, and finding someone that also looks like us, because it is very true what Dr. Thomas has mentioned about the importance of having clinicians that are of color, not just within mental health, within our government system, within, different political environments, within our classrooms, within, just the various areas that we function day to day. It's very important to have a presence. So, we and overcoming the barriers that were meant to keep us from those different areas is extremely important.
So I had a number of different thoughts in response to your question, Sheena. And I think at bottom, what's underneath your question is that, well, the issues that plague African Americans they're multivariable problems, and as mental health professionals, our primary intervention point is generally at the level of the individual, and I don't think that's trivial. And the reason I say that is well, clearly groups are comprised of individuals. And when thinking about that, it's like, let's say I know 1,000 people and you know 1,000 people. It's like 1,000 times 1,000 is 1,000,000. So that means like me coming in contact with you means I can be 1 degree away from 1,000,000. And I don't think that's trivial. So I think starting at the level of the individual is important. But I fully appreciate sort of needing to sort of make sure there's macro level solutions. And I think the role that mental health professionals can play in that regard is educating legislators and politicians about how particular phenomenon impact individuals. And so I think that's incredibly important. I really like the idea about naming your emotions in order to tame them. And because, you often hear, let's say you have an unruly child in the school who's acting out. And it's like, well, at bottom, the idea is that person's acting out something they can't say. So it's like helping people find language for what it is they're going through will help them to regulate their emotions. So I think that's incredibly important. And this idea, I think, sometimes is unpopular, particularly on the left, but I think it has to be mentioned. One of the major problems that's plaguing the African American community is the absence of a father. And so that has to be highlighted. We have to discuss that. And what that looks like on a political level, I'm not sure. But I think to some degree, we have to incentivize marriage, and we have to incentivize men staying in the lives of their children. So again, I don't know what that looks like in terms of the granular details, but I think that's in part the issue, because a lot of the issues that we see with a lot of our young Black men are in part a consequence of them not having fathers. And there are many reasons for that, many systemic reasons for that. But I think that's an important place to maybe not start, but an additional area to discuss. So.
Brother Jermaine, you touched the third rail there a little bit. My doctoral work is exactly on that. I studied healthy relationship programs and marriage programs across the country, in looking at how to support what we do know about, for example, where I work and pastor a church in the Bronx. We know that 70% of children, I mean, this is astonishing, 70% of children would have born to a single parent household. And within a decade, many, if not most of those children would have been disengaged or lost contact with their fathers. 70 to 73%, that is beyond comprehension. I think it's good to start there. I think it's, and I easily start there. My research and my conversations and like you, just about work exclusively in terms of my private practice with couples. And my book, The Ties That Bind and Bruise, is very much around working with couples. But I think to back up just a little bit, especially in times like these, in COVID-19 and with the uprising at the death of George Floyd and the protest that's going across the country, I literally have 3 books in front of me. One is on white fragility, one is on Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversation, one is on Stamp from the Beginning by Ibrahim Kendi. And all of those readings that I'm ferociously consuming is not starting with today, but in looking at history and the impact of history on the African American or the Black family today. And I think it's easy sometimes to gloss over it, but we just celebrated Juneteenth yesterday, and all that's been resonating on my heart almost exclusively is this. And I could get emotional just thinking and talking about it. But imagine it's 1865, it's the end of slavery, supposedly. It's the beginning of Reconstruction, and in Texas, the last of those who have been held captives and enslaved are told that you're no longer enslaved. What do you do? Your children, your grandchildren, your aunties, your uncles, your brothers, your sisters, your mothers, your fathers, who have been put on every Caribbean, and I've traveled in the Caribbean extensively. And one thing I always look for is the auction block. It doesn't matter where you go in the Caribbean, there's a town square. I mean, again, I've traveled the Caribbean extensively for vacation, for speaking engagement, and I invariably find the town square where people like you and I and my brothers and sisters were auctioned off. And I'm thinking about 1865, from Louisiana to Texas, to the North, to the South, to the Midwest, to across the continental United States and the Caribbean diaspora. For those that we have lost, for those that have been sold, for those that have been bartered and sold off, it's 1865. How do we find them? How do we find our brothers and our sisters and our sons and our daughters? We cannot discuss the state of African-American families today without really engaging in a courageous conversation to say that there's a direct thread between then and now, between fathers being removed and disempowered and maligned and ostracized from the children that we have given birth to the condition and the state of African-American families today. It requires another set and another level of intellectual and historical engagement that a lot of our colleagues are not prepared to engage in. But in some ways that's historical. In my work on the daily grind is very much talking about, you know, a curriculum of eating together, praying together, playing together, resolving conflict, working out our differences, co-parenting, blended families. That still needs to take place. And I readily speak that as a primary language, but I can't help but to acknowledge that history is alive today.
Can I just make a comment? Dr. Ball, thank you so much for saying that and talking about that historical context, because I think it's important because a lot of our children do not know that historical narrative. And I think it is going to be our responsibility to help the next generation really understand that historical context so that we can begin to heal that which is going on now, right? If they understood the Middle Passage, right? If they understood that, you know, when our ancestors came over here through the Middle Passage and that they were separated, how men were on top and women, well, actually women were on top and men were at the bottom, right? And if they really understood that context, and then start to connect the dots on the slave trade and how everything started, the trading and, you know, the trading for goods. And some of those goods were like, you know, sugar, but it also was material things, right? And I think some of that is still going on today. But I think if we start to educate our children and help them to understand that historical context, that possibly can mean that there may be some healing taking place in our community. And talking about like community healing, right? That, you know, that there is not that black on black crime. I don't even want to talk about that, but that's also an issue too. But I think if we start to teach some of that historical context, I think that some light bulbs might go off in some of their heads that, you know, when we think about mass incarceration, that's directly related to slavery, right? And how our big corporations own the prison system. So it's deep, but I think that if we start to teach some of that and to start to help them to understand that correlation, that maybe that can be a possible, not saying a big solution, but maybe that can be part of the problem or maybe a chip away at the problem. So thank you for bringing up that historical context, because I think it's needed in our communities.
This has been a very fiery conversation. I'm just like, whoa. So I also just want, just for the sake of moderators' privilege, to ensure that all voices are being raised here. So I want to bring our audience in. And I want to let Shenira to also speak as well.
Just thinking about basically, first off, everything that everyone has said is just awesome, amazing. great conversation. But I'm thinking too, as far as like just bringing it into, all right, what can we start doing immediately? I don't know about you all, but I really think from week to week basis, because there seems to be something new every day that happens as far as our people and the struggles that they meet daily and their needs, and even thinking about our men and the leadership role that they're trying to come into, and the constant battles that they have as far as social struggle. Just looking at things as far as their background, we talk about, them being educated as far as the history and how it plays a part in terms of their now. But some of them are coming from, years and years of conflict and generations of being inside of gangs and just constant conflict of being on the streets. They learned it from their peers and their peers' parents, and it goes backwards. Talking to them and in terms of like solution focus, getting them out of their environment. What is it, the good things that you have to work with, and really empowering them, having that, changing that conversation when they're within counseling session, meeting their basic needs, because some of them, they get wrapped up into these negative lifestyles that separate them from their families because of things they were trying to do to either meet the family's needs or meet their personal needs that they found that they weren't able to get anywhere else. And even thinking about like gang culture is very seemingly family oriented, and that's something that they yearn a place of belonging. So even if you could like find a way how to make them feel, or you can't make anyone feel anything, but provide that persuasion of feeling that belonging, feeling that connection, and really showing them what it is that they can do, what it is that they can be, and then giving them the resources to become that. And also, we're talking about this information coming out of books. Some of our men are very illiterate. Their education levels, they're men and women alike, they're not, it's just not there. So bringing that in and just kind of providing those education resources for them to level up because they're not coming from that background. So really having to meet them where they're at and finding out exactly what it is that they need to help them open up their eyes to these other things that are detrimental to their lifestyle. I really feel that that's where it should come from too. And also in terms of dealing with children, the biggest way sometimes the family's hearts is through their children. So even when they go and return to schools, making sure that programs are put into schools that help to educate children about those things that are going to be harmful for them as far as their communication skills, and helping them to feel empowered themselves, having voices. Even with the whole COVID crisis situation and kids staying home from school, they had a lot of people who were helping them to feel a little bit more stronger as far as their home lives when their home lives don't look so great. So keeping an eye out and being much more as strong advocates within our communities, and finding maybe ways to have more of these where we're bringing the voices of our clients and just making plans just to put it together. And as it was mentioned earlier, put it on a more government level. We have people who are protesting and really bringing voices, but dollars drive decisions. So if you can bring it to that level and bring in that money to make the changes, I really feel that things can happen at a bigger, grand scale.
Wow, you guys are setting Facebook on fire right now. So I'm going to have to acknowledge the audience at this point because I don't want to lose them. So there's quite a few questions that have been brought up. So if you have a notebook and want to take notes on the questions that I really want to respond to, I want to ensure that that their voices are actually being brought out at this point. Oh, here we go. So here we go. So we're going to be open and honest on this. This question really states, can white clinicians and white social workers truly provide effective treatment without having intensive racial impact training themselves? All right. So next question. Someone's got to take it at some point. So there we go. Okay. If you have a notebook or something, just kind of jot it that, because I want to read them all so we can catch up. Next question was, how can therapy be used for Black men and women in this moment in their work environments that don't necessarily respect what's happening on the national level? They're getting pressure from unions, managers, Black, and generally Black men and women earn less than their white counterparts. I believe we effectively answered this next question, but I'll read it anyway. How can we as people deal with COVID-19 and police brutality at the same time? Well, actually, I don't think we answered that part. But we always get the short end of the stick. What can we do to keep us sane as a people? And then we did answer this next question. How do we heal from trauma? There are a lot of prescriptions to that. And then there's a lot of shout outs to everyone on here. Let's see. How can we heal from trauma when no change is happening? And I think Sheena raised that point. Let's see. How do we reach children who are so disconnected from the past and present events? Okay. And then I'm going to read a couple of quotes to acknowledge what has been already said and to possibly bring up some more ideas to the next half of this conversation. This quote was something I read from a book called My Grandmother's Hand. And the quote says, life is a journey through labyrinths of trauma and its effects on modern life, especially for African Americans. And then there's a quote from James Baldwin: history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. And another quote from the book My Grandmother's Hand: our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brains. This knowledge is typically experienced as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. The body is where we fear, hope, and react, where we constrict and release, where we reflexively fight, flee, or freeze. If we are to upend the status quo of white body supremacy, we must begin with our bodies. Okay, I will stop there. And then let's try to answer the audience questions and then obviously reflect on the quotes that I just dropped on each and every one of you. Go.
All right, so
I believe
the first question that you actually discussed. The question was, this is like just in a summary that I took notes. Can Caucasian social workers provide therapy to African American people without cultural sensitivity training? So yeah, that was the question. So in my opinion, I feel like it's absolutely and definitely needed for, you know, if a white social worker is providing therapy to an African American family, I absolutely say they definitely should take a cultural sensitivity training, or just kind of like dig online, look at some books into what is it like working with African American families, or just kind of like have some type of background information on, you know, African American traditions, foods, holidays, different things like that, because you know, without it, you're kind of going into the therapy session blinded, and that could definitely make the therapy session not go well if you kind of not do any research about that ethnic group. For example, I'll give a quick little story. Since Juneteenth was yesterday, I remember I had sent like a group chat to my coworkers saying Happy Juneteenth, and my battery is running low. Okay, I'll be quick because my computer battery is running low. I sent like a group chat to my coworkers saying Happy Juneteenth, and not that many people liked it. Not that many people said anything. One person did ask, what's Juneteenth? And I'm like, we're in an age of Google right now. So we're in an age of Google. So I'm like, do your research. Like, there should be no more questions of what is Juneteenth or, you know, any type of African-American holidays. They're just too much right now out here as far as internet, social media, books. So, you know, what I'm saying is basically, it was just, I just kind of felt a little, not angry, but I just kind of like, wow, you're really asking what is Juneteenth? Like, we're in a day and age where you can just go online and look at it. And because us as social workers, a lot of like the population that I work with, we're working with families that are mainly Black and brown. So do your research. And to go back to the question that Darryl had stated, can white social workers provide therapy to Black people? Yes, they can. I'm not saying they can't. But before you do it, definitely go and do your research on Black families, Black cultures, because you do not ever want to go into a therapy session and not have any clue or the struggle of what it is like being a single mother, a Black single mother, because you would not want to know what the response is. If I was a Black single mom and I have a Caucasian social worker and I may have maybe canceled 3 sessions because I'm like, oh, you know, no one can watch my child. That social worker that's Caucasian may say, well, you know, where's your husband? Or why can't your mom watch your baby? And it's just like, there's certain things sometimes as a Black mother, maybe what if I don't have a mom? Or what if me and my mom don't have a good relationship? I've had clients where where the client's like, yeah, I have a mom, but my mom kicked me out of my house and my mom disowned me. And, you know, I have children and, you know, I may cancel a few times of my for sessions. So as a social worker that is Caucasian, you have to be sensitive to a Black mother that you might be providing therapy to. You have to be sensitive of knowing what it is like being a single mother. So that's my little rant.
If I can chime in, I have a story that when you started with your story, I was like, oh, I have the perfect story for this. But before I start with my story, I'll just say, as far as I think the question said, can white clinicians and psychologists, can they provide therapy to African Americans without having like some type of sensitivity training? I don't know that I would say that they can't. But what I will say is that when you are a clinician of any kind and you are going into therapy work with any person that represents a different culture other than yours, I think that you need to go into that situation with a level of inquisitiveness and self-awareness about your own stuff and your own way that you interact with people and your own ideas maybe about this person's culture. And with that self-awareness and with your own kind of idea about your own stuff, you will be able to provide better counseling services to a client that represents a culture that is different from yours. The story that I have, I was working in a mental health clinic and I grew up Pentecostal. So I had a client who was a young girl. She was not even over 10. And she was having issues. And one of the things she kept saying was, the devil made me do it. Or I hear the devil telling me to do bad things. Or I hear the devil. And I did not do her initial intake, but the person who did, after hearing this story about the devil, wrote down that she was having psychosis, that she was struggling and dealing with psychosis. And this person was not a Caucasian person. So again, this is the importance of it not just being a Black or a white thing, but it just being this level of understanding cultures and understanding religion for what religion is for people and just the culture of people, period. And so that kind of blew my mind. And when I got the client and I'm talking to her and I'm looking over her paperwork, but I'm talking to her and I'm like taking in what she's saying, but also reflecting on what was written down about her. I'm like, wow, you know, if this client would have gotten to the desk of someone else who had if she was going to be seeing someone who had no maybe awareness or understanding of Black culture and Black church, they would have been prescribing her medication, and they would have been treating her as if she was experiencing some type of psychotic break or having deeper psychiatric issues. So it's just extremely important that we take more time to understand the people that we're sitting across from, because I would have never wrote down that this client was having psychosis. One, I would have been having more conversations with the parents. How is religion talked about in the home? How often are you all attending church? Is this a theme that you all share a lot? Oh, the devil is busy. That's a big thing in the Black community, Black church. The devil is busy, or he's always up to something. That's just kind of how we are. That's what we say. And so that's my story. That just blew my mind. And that's something that I'll never forget. But I'll just end and wrap up with this, just the reminder of just having, as a clinician, it is your responsibility to be aware of your own stuff, to be aware of your own transference, to be aware of your own issues and traumas, and to just practice self-awareness. And when you are going into a counseling session with someone, because when I meet with people who is not African-American and they represent a culture, they may be Indian or they may practice Muslim religion, I go and I learn the stuff, but if they say something in session that I don't have any idea about, I say, would you mind sharing more with me about that? I'm not really familiar with this piece of your culture, but do you mind sharing more with me about that? And that helps build rapport, and it helps people feel supported, because it makes them feel like, oh, you're interested and you're actually taking time to understand and hear what I'm saying, and you're holding space for me. So that's what I got.
So I think also, in addition to a level of cultural competence, I think it's also important I think oftentimes we take the Black experience and we categorize it as a whole. So I absolutely think that clinicians of Caucasian descent should be informed and culturally competent in terms of the services that they are providing to the client. However, I also think that it's very important to, on an individual basis, although across the line of Black or people of color or of Indigenous descent have had similar experiences with race-based trauma, that the effects of that particular trauma or traumatic experience varies along from person to person. So not to kind of categorize the individual's experience as the Black experience, but more so taking into account the individual as a whole. And I also wanted to speak to, because as you were reading the questions, Darryl, just in hearing police brutality, I know my fiance is watching. Shout out to you, baby. So I just wanted to address, in terms of police brutality and the effects that it has. I know he recently traveled to Minnesota in representation of Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd. And in returning, one of his mantras was fighting justice with your left hand and then police brutality with your right. And I think we have to kind of change the narrative with the way in which we view trauma, right? Because in addition to there being a historical context, there's also historical trauma that is associated with the Black experience, right? So I think it's very important to be able to look at the ways in which we can bridge the race relations gap, so that it's not just, I know we have, as Black people, we have a Black agenda, but we need to also include other nationalities in the conversation, because those that are in power and the powers that be definitely need to be included in the conversation, so that we can begin to address and have courageous conversations that address the conscious, subconscious misconceptions that are present from both ends of the spectrum, so that we can begin to start the process of healing. We cannot talk about healing until the actual trauma or the stress-related trauma is actually removed. And because it hasn't been removed, we have to look at, because we can't heal unless it's actually removed. So I'm thinking within myself that it has to be, we have to have some conversation. We have to have some transparent, transformative conversations with regard to various nationalities, so that we can begin to educate, we can begin to learn, unlearn and relearn, the ways in which we see and experience life, so that we can begin to move forward.
I'd like to piggyback off of some of that. So as far as whether or not white clinicians are competent enough to work with Black clients, I feel like they certainly have to be. They have to be encouraged to become culturally competent, because it's like the truth is African Americans make up 13% of the population, and whites make up 60%. So it's the likelihood of a Black client sort of interfacing with a white clinician is very high. So I think it's really important that our training systems really educate clinicians on working with people of different ethnicities and different races, because if not, everyone suffers if that's not the case. I want to also speak to the quotes that were mentioned, because I found those incredibly profound. And there's this idea that is attributed to Sigmund Freud. He's the preeminent psychologist of the early 20th century. And he says that everyone's endowed with this repetition compulsion. And it's this idea that, well, you repeat what you don't understand. And I think that is very much applicable for both Blacks and for whites. And we often talk about how African Americans are negatively impacted by slavery and they're replicating their trauma, which I think is very much true. But when you think about, let's say you see these photographs of Blacks being lynched, and you have these whites who are standing around looking at this event in this really casually indifferent way. Some of that has also been transmitted through the generations too. And because, oftentimes you have these, you'll have these videos where you have Black people being killed, and it seems like there's an absence, there's sort of a inappropriate absence of empathy sometimes when white people are looking at these things. And it's like, well, they have to reckon with their own trauma as well, because it's like something has gone awry in terms of their own psyche, where they can see someone who's being brutalized and not feel what we would expect someone would feel, right? So I think there's a lot that has to go on both sides concerning, rectifying the legacies of our past and our brutal past. So.
This is a perfect transition, and I don't want to miss this moment. I want to show a quick clip, and then we can continue the reflections of the quotes and the questions that were posed. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully I'm successful.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, and then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors. survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, you know, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD is a disorder that occurs as a result of a single trauma. You don't even have to be there to actually get a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You could just hear about something horrific happening to someone you love. So you have people who have experienced it firsthand, people who have witnessed it in their environment, right? People who are continuing to be oppressed. That exacerbates any possibility of healing. So it's not post-traumatic stress disorder, because then it becomes part of what we call your socialization process. So you begin to normalize a way of living and being, everything from what we eat to what we believe it means to be a friend. You know, all of these things are colored by history. And if you don't understand it, you're going to fold in things that you've just assumed are normal. But post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, feeling of foreshortened future. There was a point where there were, you know, African-American children in different urban settings that didn't expect to live to be adults because they saw so much death, that they started planning their funerals like at 13, 12, as young as 10. When you start looking at the simple biology, you start looking at the impact of stress on health. And while we look at general stress, you know, we know finances, you have illnesses, all these different things. How about being black? How does factoring in being black in America impact your stress level and therefore your body's ability to operate its own immune system? Because we know it compromises the immune system. Once you understand it, then you can deal with it. Because you see, it's habitual. You're socialized. It becomes part of your being. So one of the ways you begin to address that multi-generational trauma is to work with the people it directly impacts, to hear from them. And when you give the people the information, they can use it. I think the first order of business is beginning to have a conversation. And the other is to educate the larger society. You have to stop the assault. So this is not purely a clinical thing. This requires social justice and change. That's where part of the healing is. It's not in a clinical setting or in a pill. It's in fairness and justice and safety and equity. We got to work with some of those clinical things, some of those issues of panic and anxiety. And we also have to deal with the fact that you have a system that is set up to oppress you and to continue to injure you. Both those things have to be dealt with. And they cannot singularly by themselves affect a change. They have to be done collectively.
Go.
In some ways, I think that this historical racism and oppression that the speaker is talking about is very much, right? It's in some ways, and the truth of the matter is that over the years, I continue to really reflect on and attempt to unpack this thing, right? It's embedded and memorialized in the language that we speak, in what is beauty, right? It's long hair, it is blue eyes, it is, fair or white skin, it is, right? It is in what's good and what's evil. Some of my colleagues might remember, I imagine at some point I might have shared Dr. Kenneth Clark's research in the 1950s on brown skin versus light skin, the doll study. You might remember that piece that I've shown over the years. So it's memorialized. It's who are the movie stars and who are the victims and who are the villains and who are the heroes in the movie. It's the news broadcasters. It's like it's who are the police officers and who are the robbers. It's alive everywhere and at all times. It's the people who are the managers when you go to the restaurants, who comes around in a suit and says, how was your dinner this evening? It's also the folks who are cleaning the table. It's who are the landscapers and who are the executive directors. It's alive everywhere and at all times. And we, as children, I was just doing some reading that says that children begin to differentiate and distinguish issues of race and injustices by the time they are in kindergarten. And so we embody and we take on these things and we believe them from a very young age. And it doesn't matter how much we, intellectualize and theorize on it. The truth of the matter, and I'll share this quick story with my colleagues and then I'm going to step back. It's a story that I've been telling over the years that my babysitter, many years ago, my daughter just graduated from high school yesterday, but when she was about 4 years old, some of you might remember that story that I've told in class. When she was about 4 years old, she came downstairs and the babysitter was sitting in the kitchen and she was having breakfast. And in my house, you come into my house, you eat, right? And the babysitter was having breakfast. And my 4-year-old daughter said to the babysitter, "What are you doing? You are eating? You're not supposed to be eating. You're supposed to be working, working, working. Forget my theories and forget my beliefs and whatever it is." That child in that moment, what she knew and what she saw was that this woman, that her existence in our house was based on work. And so when she saw her doing something differently than working, it was astonishing to her. And so it doesn't matter what we believe, what we have to do is look at the way society is structured, the way family systems are structured. And it's in those ordinary, exchanges that we deduce and ascribe meaning to who we are in society.
Oh, no one? Okay. So
I'll go. I feel like I've been speaking a bit, so I didn't want to, go too much. So, I often think about what it must have been like to be, let's say, an enslaved mother. And I think about, an enslaved Black woman, and let's say she has, two children. Maybe she has a quasi or pseudo husband, and I qualify it that way because it wasn't though her relationship was honored by the state. And I think about, let's say she's being raped by her slave master, right? And there's not much that her husband can do about it, because if he tries to do anything about it, well, he's going to be subject to harsh punishment, right? And maybe because of the shame that, let's say, the slave master feels if she gets impregnated and he then sells her child off, I then think about, well, how could someone get through that, right? And my sense is that the only way in which someone could have survive through that is by way of dissociation. And I think that still persists in our community today, where there are these terrible things that are going on, but people will have a hard time naming what they're feeling. Because the only way in which they could have survived something like that is to just work, maybe sort of lean on the positive side of life, use a whole lot of humor, do all those things to get through. And you'll often see that today. And so I think it's really important that we link the way in which people operate today back to the past, because it's like after, and Dr. Grew makes this point, it's like after slaves were liberated in 1865, it wasn't as though they said, well, let's get these people therapy. So what ends up happening is the way in which these people operate just gets transmitted through the generations by way of learning or epigenetics, right? And it's like that really has to be reckoned with. And unfortunately, what's happened is a lot of things that are going on in the Black community have been siphoned off from history. And when that happens, the natural response is to blame the victim. And it's like, we have to contextualize all these things and what has happened historically. And I think our society is woefully undereducated on what's happened to Black people. And I think, the question was asked, well, what do we do collectively? I think a great place to start is in the schools. It's like, we need to stop selling or providing students this sanitized history about what happened to Black people, because these people who, let's say, grow up to be legislators and politicians or who have positions of authority, these are the kids who were undereducated years ago, you know what I mean? And it's like, they don't know anything. So it's like something terrible happens and they start to villainize Black people because they don't know where these things actually came from. And even, the violence that sometimes pervades certain select pockets of Black communities, it's like, it's an additional legacy of slavery. Because if you're subject to harsh violence for years, what you end up doing is you replicate it, and you end up becoming sort of a co-conspirator in your own plight. Because it's like you've been taught not to see your fellow, let's say, racial group member as someone of value because of how they've been treated for so long. And so there's all these killings and all these types of things that people talk about in Chicago and whatnot. It's like, that didn't just come out of nowhere, and I think people really need to educate themselves on that. So, so I'll stop with that.
I'm sorry, I hope I didn't go in front of someone's turn, but I have just been, my mind is blown, because in listening to the video and listening to what different people are saying, Dr. Ball and Dr. Thomas and my other colleagues who are on the Zoom call, I've never sat and thought about how when we were free all those years ago, slaves weren't freed with resources, and they weren't freed with a card to a therapist. And it's like all of the trauma that they experienced, it only perpetuated through generations and through family cycles and family systems. And I think, Dr. Thomas, you said, nail on the head, you said the only way that people had to cope with it was to dissociate. And I would like to throw in there, like, they dissociated, but they also leaned on spirituality. And I think that's where we got this kind of like, just put it in God's hands. And all these years we're putting it in God's hands. And I think that it's so, we have to put it in his hands, yes. But there was also this side of us that we were neglecting, which was being able to name what was happening in us and in our external worlds in order to tame how we could move forward and kind of be resourceful for ourselves. So that is just, I'm going to be thinking on that for a while, because I never really thought about how, clearly the oppression continued, but I never took a deeper dive at how, wow, it was like, you're free, but then, okay, what does that mean? I have papers, but you didn't give me resources. And as an entire, I'm sure there were some slaves who were free that got resources, but as a whole, you didn't have resources. You didn't have, okay, well, this is the how-to guide, or we didn't have mentors. Our ancestors didn't have mentors on how to establish yourself in the world after being a free slave. So it's just like that. It's just I think of my own experience growing up in South Carolina in a small town, and just thinking about how all of the ways that I was raised, all the traditions that I have as a young child, how all of that, it came from our ancestors, and how we were all conditioned, and that trauma just perpetuated, and the family dynamics and the generational curses, quote unquote, all of that just kind of filtered on down through the line. And it's amazing to kind of put those pieces together and look at it from that perspective, because we knew that the oppression continued. But when you really think of it, there was no time where we sat and we said we need to deal with trauma. Trauma what? No one all those years ago knew to call what they dealt with trauma. So amazing.
I was going to say, thank you for bringing up the word spirituality. As I think about the aspect of spirituality, I think that historically that I want to say the Black church, there are practices that I think that are unhealthy, that have been passed down, that we still perpetuate, that has been the root of some of the problems that we have, especially when it comes to our mental health. One, because a lot of churchgoers, they believe that their pastor is their psychologist, and there are pastors who are not trained. Now, I believe in the power of prayer. Let me clear that up. I do believe in the power of prayer, but there are some things that prayer and counseling can do. All right. And so I think that we also need to change the narrative of that, within the Black church. And the reason why I'm saying the Black church is because when we think about before we had the Black church, we had the invisible church, right? That's where the slaves went on their own, right? They had church in their backyard. They had church in the woods, right? And they experienced God in their way. And that was a form of therapy for them, right? So I'm not, negating that. But I think that we need to change the narrative of the Black church being a voice as in spirituality, and also providing what I would call social justice as well. Because Jesus was a social justice. He spoke to the marginalized, right? He went and healed those who were poor. Those who were sick and blind and that needed healing. So I think that the church also has a responsibility to help their churchgoers, to help them to understand the importance of healthy spirituality. That it is okay to ask God those big questions that we have, that it's not okay to keep our feelings in, but we can ask God those questions. So I think that as leaders, as a leader, I have a responsibility to say it is okay to ask God those big questions. God can, Job did it, right? The other part I want to talk about too is the aspect of that God is a God of justice, right? So Micah 8 talks about, it says to do justice. And so there is that social justice aspect that I think that a lot of our, pastors and church leaders, they need to embrace, right? That social justice aspect. Yes, God wants us to pray and be saved and filled with the Holy Spirit. I get all that. But then there's a responsibility of the church to be that voice, right? To be that voice that prepares the way to help speak truth to power. And so my thing is that, I just feel that it is so important for us not to continue to perpetuate unhealthy spiritual practices. And that, we should definitely, that's a whole nother conversation for another day, because we have a lot of white evangelicals who are not speaking about racism, right? And so we have to really come to the table with this, because, we can say that, we have to really also understand the history of Christianity, and how, if we're not careful, that we can say that, okay, the Bible was used to enslave us, right? But it was taken out of context, right? And so there's a lot of illiterate people who are biblically illiterate, if that makes sense. And I think that we have a responsibility as, a Christian community to be biblically literate, so we can understand that certain things were taken out of context to help control the people that was not necessarily true. So that's a whole nother conversation, but I'm just bringing that point of that, you know, when it comes to the church, we have a responsibility to educate and to help others know that it is okay to talk about Jesus and justice, because Jesus was not a punk, right? Jesus went and helped the marginalized, and he healed those who were sick. And so that's where we also need to start pointing. And so how do we contextualize that? We talk about those who are poor, those who are, you know, when we think about the systematic things that are going on, it is our responsibility to speak that truth to power.
Can I, as a pastor, can I jump in on that? You've just triggered me, sister. You've just triggered me big time. I probably have about 3 books that I'm reading right now on colonialism, Christianity, and how it is that God himself, in some ways, have been captured and locked in a box as white, as is Eurocentric. And I think that a new theology, a new imagination needs to be, you use the word imagining, a new imagination needs almost to be reconstructed. And it's what I've personally been talking about with my congregation and forums like these. And I think James Allen Cone has really offered a deep and meaningful way that there's no Christianity that does not include advocacy for the oppressed, the marginalized, the maligned, the widow, the immigrants, I mean, that could go on and on and on. And to look at Jesus's ministry, I was talking to my friend, Christine Cavalucci, who was my mentor and supervisor, and talking about these very issues, that it is critically important for us to fully understand that that Jesus himself really challenged the status quo, was subverted the predominant narrative. And so I think you are probably onto something, and I know you know what you're onto, that us Christians, we can no longer afford to be, and by the way, the issue of social justice, it cannot be progressive, it cannot be something that is northern, it cannot be something that is not conservative. I would say it is deeply conserving and conservative that every Christian because James Allen Cone would argue, Jesus was lynched. George Floyd was lynched. And to really be a Christian, it fundamentally means to advocate for those who are oppressed, for those who are, whether they were oppressed spiritually, he went into the graveyard and pulled them out. Whether they were oppressed by death, he went into the tomb and he pulled up Lazarus. Whether they had physical illness, I mean, I don't want to sound preachy here, but I'm going to stop there. But to be clear, the work of Jesus Christ is the liberator, and he liberates people he liberated women, he liberated people who were Samaritans, he liberated the children, he liberated those that were dead and forgotten and marginalized and maligned. So bottom line, you can't be a Christian if you're not preaching the gospel of liberation. And so thank you, sister. I'm excited by your foray into liberation theology.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. That was really powerful. So the last thing I'll say, because I have to go, I promised my wife I'd look after our son around this time, so I have to keep my word on that. A few things have been said about Christ, and I think there's a lot of psychological utility in the biblical stories. And, when you think about Christ, it's sort of the ultimate sort of tragic and the ultimate hero story, because it's like, well, he's born to peasant parents, and he's, there's sort of this effort to commit infanticide and have him killed, but he survives it, right? And then he's this really precocious kid. He says that he teaches the leaders in the church, or in the temples rather. And then he ends up being betrayed. He ends up being betrayed by his own religious community, and just being betrayed by his own followers. And even when he's on the cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So it almost feels as if he's been betrayed by God himself, right? And he has a knowledge that all these things are going to happen, right? And it's like, clearly it's terrifying to him, because it's like, well, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying to the Father, and it's like he's sweating droplets of blood, right? But he voluntarily pursues his suffering. He carries his cross. And then, well, he rises from the dead. And there's this idea that, well, if you voluntarily pursue your suffering, you can transcend it. And there's something that's really, really, I think, powerful about that, where it's like, well, there's something about confronting what's troubling you that's courageous. And I think that idea is implicitly sort of articulated in that narrative. And not only that, it's like, it's very mysterious. You know, in the book of John, Christ is associated with the Word. It's like, and he was God. And it's like, it's really a strange thing when you think about that. And then you think, well, what does that mean? And you know, it said, well, God creates the world by way of his speech, right? And it said, well, we're made in God's image. So what does that mean? It's like, well, we get to engage in a divine process of our words. It's like we can create habitable order out of chaos. And it's like, it's like that idea is so profound. So when people are like, well, what do I do with this trauma? It's like, that feels so chaotic. It's like, articulate it. And it's like, because you can create this habitable world for yourself you can actually live in a speech. And I think, you know, there's so many things in the biblical corpus that speak to that. So it's been a pleasure talking with you guys today. I wish I could stay for a bit more time, but I have to go. But I hope you guys continue this conversation, and if there's any other events like this, I'm happy to participate. So you guys take care.
So actually, that is a good segue to button up the conversation. Obviously, we have not answered all the questions. That's just obvious. So, you know, I don't know. Maybe a part 3. I don't know. I'll just toss out a little bait, a question that did come up. We don't need an answer to it, but is racism a mental disorder? That's just like a whole nother conversation. So that was on the lineup, but in terms of time, I certainly do not want to belabor it. My hope is that we can get the group back together again to have that discussion. This was just powerful. I tell you, I was an intellectual. No. Yeah, I'm an intellectual heaven, so this is great. This is great. So for those on Facebook Live, please share this conversation. By the way, this is, you know, for a politician to be hosting this type of conversation, it is kind of moving and shaking. You know, so in this, just being involved in this forum, in this time to talk freely about a Black agenda is quite radical in itself. And yes, we intend to ensure that this message gets to high places, in particular around my work around the presidential election. So for those that are on the panel, if you'd like to leave your social media handles or website or your businesses, this is the time to do that, and then we will close.
Sorry, were we supposed to go in order? Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just go, I guess, because I was number 1. So Tiara Anderson, my Instagram is little bit complicated, but it's Call Me Royalty. Call Me Royal with the T-E-E. So again, Call Me Royal with the T-E-E. And I also have a book club. So for people in the DMV area, if you're interested, or even if you're not in DMV area, the book club, that Instagram handle is Crowned and Booked at Gmail. I'm sorry, I'm giving you my email. It's Crowned and Booked. So those are my Instagram handles. And then of course, my name on Facebook is Tiara Anderson. I look forward to continuing to connect with all of you and even connecting with people who did tune in who may have follow-up questions. This was really, really great. I feel like every part is going to get better. And before you know it, we're going to be in part 20.
Shenira Billups. My Facebook is Shenira Billups. You can find me right here. I have a website, mentalgrowthinternalhealing.com, and I'm actually supposed to be coming up with an event in September. More detail with that, but basically it's dealing with mental growth and community outreach, case management. A lot of what was talked about tonight. So I'll be putting more information up on my Facebook and on the mentalgrowthinternalhealing.com website. My Instagram is at clinical_Lynn. That's LYNN. And that's about it. Thank you for having me tonight.
Hi, I'm Chaz Brackeen. My name on Facebook is the same, Chaz Brackeen. My name on Instagram is the same, Chaz Brackeen. And this was definitely a great discussion tonight. I can't wait to part 3.
Again, my name is Malikka Miller, and my Facebook name is Danny Girl, DANNY_GIRL Miller. And I look forward to part 3 of this awesome discussion amongst such distinguished panelists. And I also invite you all to please join me in a conversation, Bridging the Gap Safe Space Initiative. I am the founder, and I will be hosting a conversation about bridging the gap in regards to race relations in Black and white America. I welcome each and every one of you. It will be taking place this Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. And I welcome you, and I look forward to all that will come about from the discourse that is present on this day.
Hi, everyone. I am Sheena Hutchinson, and my Facebook handle is my first and last name, so Sheena Hutchinson on Facebook. And then on Instagram, I am Sheen So Blessed on IG, and that's how you can find me.
I think I would very much like to go after Sheena, only because you have truly inspired me. My name is Roger Ball, and my website is drrogerball. That's drrogerball.com. My email is drrogerball@gmail.com. And I am an author, a pastor, an assistant principal, a professor, most importantly, a father and a husband. And those are the things that, you know, at my funeral, that's what I want to be remembered for, that I was a father and a husband. And it's great to be here. I do want to read a quick passage from one of the many books that's sitting on my desk that is reading. It's very short. Just to reaffirm us as a people, it is Toni Morrison on the origin of others. And she says that the necessity of rendering the slave a foreign species appears to be a desperate attempt to confirm one's own self as normal. She continues by saying, it's as though they are shouting, I am not a beast. I am not a beast. I torture the helpless to prove that I am not weak. It's a reminder to all of us that we are created in the imago Dei. We are created in the image of God. And we are beautiful, we are wonderful, we are fearfully made. My book, The Ties That Bind and Bruise, can be found on Amazon. And my forthcoming book is for all the single folks out there, and it's called Deconstructing Love. It's a clinical, theological offering for all the folks who are looking for love, and that will be coming out this summer. Again, drrajaball.com. Thank you so much. And by the way, thank you so much for having me. I am excited and humbled and honored to have sat on the same panel with two of my former students, Chaz and Malikka. So good to meet the rest of you as well.
All right, folks. Have a good night.
Bye.